Welcome to Evacuation Day. Evacuation Day was the biggest holiday event in New York for 80 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. What was it all about? On November 20th of this year, a group of us got together to portray the events of that day in a walking tour. 6 history interpreters participated and 30 guests joined us on the tour route. From left to right, we are Scott McScott as Mr. Hamilton, Ruth Vazquez as Mrs. Van Rensselaer, Mrs. Q, John Koopman as General Washington, Kyle Jenks as Mr. Ackerman, and Bev Tyler as Mr. Woodhull. For those who could not join us, I've recreated the tour here for you to enjoy. Before we start, all photos were taken by Mr. Q, our friend Margot Arceri of Tri-Spy Tours in Setauket, New York, and professional photographer Andrea McScott. You can find links to Margot's tours and Andrea's work in the video description. Please check them out after you've finished watching. Our tour begins with Mrs. Q, me, and my sister, Mrs. Van R, celebrating the removal of the last British ships and soldiers from New York City on November 25, 1783. After 7 long years of occupation, the city is free of British rule and back in the hands of patriot New Yorkers. The ladies have returned to the city after a 7-year exile in Mrs. Van R's home near Albany to find it in a shambles. Houses ruined by occupying soldiers and 1/4 of the city, including Trinity Church, destroyed by fire. In spite of this, it's a day of celebration and looking forward to the future as our own country free of British rule. Let's go for a walk and see who else we can find today. Is that Mr. Hamilton leaving the Tontine Coffee House? Mr. Hamilton recognizes us and comes over to greet the ladies. Mr. Hamilton is always a favorite, and the crowd shows their enthusiasm with cheers and applause when he bows in greeting to us. Mr. Hamilton explains that he has just come from a meeting with a few other gentlemen at the Tontine Coffee House about opening a new bank, the Bank of New York. A conversation about the future economics of the city takes place. Mr. Hamilton and I express our mutual excitement that New York is now free of British laws limiting trade and manufactures. There are endless possibilities ahead. We even have some fun and laughs with our guests. Next stop, Printing House Square. This is where Mr. Hamilton's very first published works were printed in 1775. 8 years ago now. Mr. Hamilton reminds the group that he is a practicing lawyer and very much interested in the future of law and the fairness of the way it is applied to everyone in the future. His rates, he assures us, are very fair if anyone is in need of legal representation. Mrs. Q, I, ask a question that shocks Mrs. Van R and Mr. Hamilton. Now that British rule is over, will we allow the ladies to own their own property? I have inherited my property and shop from our father, but it is Mr. Q who owns it. Will Mrs. Q have the right to own her family property? Mrs. Van R is shocked at the radical notion, but Mr. Hamilton reminds me that New York is the only state in which a man who has inherited his wife's property cannot dispose of it without her permission. And that permission must be given by the wife without her husband present to ensure there is no duress. For now, I agree, that will have to do. The group moves on to Hanover Square. My home and shop are located. Here we meet my old friend and neighbor, Mr. James Ackerman, and we learn that Mr. Ackerman, unlike me, has not returned from exile, but has remained in the city for the entire British occupation. It turns out that Mr. Ackerman, a lukewarm loyalist, thought it was safer to stay in the city under the protection of the British, only to find out that he was treated not much better than a rebel himself. Now that the rebels have returned, Mr. Ackerman expresses his anxiety about what will happen to him. The notorious Sons of Liberty, known for committing heinous acts against loyalists, are also returning. Will they be looking for retribution? A conversation between Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Ackerman reveals that there is a growing spirit of reconciliation in the city, and that loyalists who did not serve in the King's army or provide material support to them will be able to stay if they proclaim their loyalty to New York. Mr. Hamilton stresses his own belief that people who did not serve the King should be able to stay here in New York in their homes. Plus, Their talents will be needed to help return the city to prosperity. The sisters pause to answer a question from a guest, and the group moves on. On Stone Street, we meet a gentleman from the country known only to Mr. Ackerman. The gentleman is Abraham Woodhull, visiting from Setauket, Long Island, New York. There is an audible gasp from our group when his identity is revealed. Mr. Woodhull tells us he is looking for his friend from Setauket, Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, and is also visiting Robert Townsend, who has a shop nearby. We learn that Mr. Ackerman and Mr. Woodhull have been engaging in business during the time of the occupation, and then something shocking is revealed. Mr. Woodhull has been using his business relationship with Mr. Ackerman to spy. He is the spy known as Culper Sr. of the now famous Culper spy ring. Mr. Hamilton recognizes the name and is stunned to meet the man whose coded messages he has seen and passed on to General Washington. He thanks Mr. W., as he's known him, for taking on such a dangerous role to serve the cause. Mr. Ackerman and Mr. Woodhull make amends and, in the spirit of moving forward without hostilities, shake hands. Mr. Woodhull explains that in his town of Setauket there are people who were patriots and people who were loyalists, and that they are all learning to live together again. On to the next stop. The group pauses for a few minutes while Mr. Ackerman tells the story of the Great Fire of September 1776, which burned 1/4 of the city and left hundreds of dwellings destroyed. Mr. Ackerman was one of the men who climbed to the roof of St. Paul's Chapel and took part in the successful effort to save the church from the fire. There is also some shocking discussion about how the fire started in the Fighting Cock's Tavern. Scandalous indeed! When the group turns to continue our walk, we see His Excellency the General standing nearby. Mr. Hamilton leads the way. He and the General find themselves in a happy reunion. Mr. Hamilton introduces the General to the group, and the General bows to the ladies. The General addresses the concerns of everyone and assures us there will be a speedy return to law and order and safety for the people of New York. Mr. Hamilton introduces the General to Mr. Woodhull and explains his true identity. The General thanks him for his bravery and loyalty. Mr. Woodhull replies that he was grateful for the opportunity to serve. The group then moves on to Fraunces Tavern. Here we engage in a series of 13 toasts. These were the same toasts offered the night of November 25th, 1783 at Fraunces Tavern. We thank our guests and then pose for pictures. To those of you who joined us, thank you so much for coming out. The event was so successful that we are already planning more of this street theater history for you for next year. These events will be accessible both in person and via live stream, and we will be bringing our performance on the road to Philadelphia. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more video about the great history of New York and the American Revolution. If you enjoy my work, consider supporting me. Check the video description for ways to do that. Until next time, and on behalf of all of our cast, I'm Karen Q, and thank you so much for watching.